Bruce DuMont back in hour number 2 of Beyond the Beltway. Thank you very much. In studio, we have Patrick Hanley. He is a management consultant and a Democrat. And Josh Cantro is a conservative Republican attorney. They are both from Chicago. And also, Robert Pape is also from Chicago. He is with the University of Chicago. He's one of the world's leading experts on suicide bombing. He has written the book Bombing to Win, and a number of books on air power. And Bob, take a moment, if you will, before we get back to questioning. Tell us a little bit about the center that you had dealing with national security.
Thanks. So at the University of Chicago, I'm the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. This is a broad-based center on national security. We are not focused on any one issue. We have professors at the center that focus on military alliances. We have focus on intelligence. Myself, of course, I work a lot on air power, terrorism, and it is also a center that's not necessarily just international security. So in the last several years, we've done more work on American political violence because that's become a crucial threat to our national security. The center has been going since 2004. It was started by the Defense Department under George W. Bush in 2004, and it has been funded and supported by every Pentagon ever since, and also I've been fortunate enough to advise every White House since. Mm-hmm. So it's a opportunity here to learn more about it. You go to CPost, you can go to our website, you can learn more about it. And you can see that it not just includes myself, but there are half dozen now young tenured and tenure track faculty at the University of Chicago who also contribute in various ways.
Okay. Before the break, a question was asked by Patrick Hanley about the impact of our departure from Afghanistan, and how is this playing within the various extreme terrorist networks, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. What lessons are they learning from our conduct?
Well, we need to focus on what is the impact just in the next few weeks versus what's the longer term impact of our ground force withdrawal likely to be. Given what's happened in the last 3 weeks, just how disastrous and messy this ground force withdrawal has been, what we have done is we have, unfortunately, in the very near term, done quite a bit to embolden not just ISIS-K in Afghanistan, but ISIS Central in Iraq and Syria has been promoting the work, promoting ISIS-K's attacks in Afghanistan, especially aggressively in the last week and a half. We have a center, part of our center does Arabic propaganda, so we have native Arabic speakers. I'm speaking with some specific knowledge about this. And so the fact is, in the very near term, the disastrous way in which this withdrawal has been handled in the last 3 weeks has created a problem we need to be quite concerned about. Now, over time, we need to recognize that suicide terrorism is like lung cancer. There are many causes of lung cancer, but there's one in particular, smoking, which causes lung cancer to skyrocket. Suicide terrorism is similar. Many causes, but there's one combat troop presence on territory the terrorists prize that causes that suicide attacks to skyrocket. That's why before we put heavy ground forces in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001 and 3, there were no suicide attacks in Iraq and Afghanistan.
What do we know about?
And now they're coming down in both countries.
What do we know? Because you have studied every single suicide attack for the last umpteen years. What is the common denominator? Now, granted, the person is dead, but I mean, you've done research on their background. What are the common denominators that create a suicide bomber?
About 90%, not 100%. Again, this is a little bit like lung cancer. Like 90% of suicide attacks are in direct response to a military occupation where there are ground forces, I mean tanks, armored vehicles, combat troops on territory, occupying territory that the terrorists prize.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when those combat troops are there, there can be a whole variety of specific triggers that occur. So it's not just one and only one way in which the combat troops turn out to be a magnet and inspire suicide attacks. But it is the number one way for about 90%. And by the way, there are plenty of secular suicide bombers, and they're not just religious. So you might say, oh, well, they're all Muslim or they're all this, they're all that. Well, that's not really true. So the fact is, how CPOS got started is I collected the first complete database of all suicide attacks around the world shortly after 9/11. That was then funded by the Bush Pentagon, even though I was telling Paul Wolfowitz directly in 2002 that if we invaded Iraq, the data showed this would touch off the largest suicide terrorist campaign in modern times. They still went forward. The word came back to me that we were still going to do that war, but we were going to create an air base at Ayudid in Qatar so we could move our troops, more of our troops out of Saudi Arabia. That was, sort of a bow to the data. And then it turned out in 2004, the Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld Pentagon started funding CPOST, which was really quite striking because I was telling them they were doing everything to create the next 9/11, not stop it. That led then to, anyway, so the answer here, Bruce, is that there's a lot of different varieties, the pieces in this cocktail, but the key thing you need to know is that just like with lung cancer, 90% of suicide attacks come with a cause, which is in response to foreign ground forces. And so, yep, there still could be a little bit of suicide. But if you think that popping an army in is going to make us safer, got another, you just haven't seen the data. The data just puts very strongly that we need to look for other tools, other approaches, which is how I tried to argue for the over-the-horizon policy as a way to keep us safe while not overreacting and making the problem worse.
So an over-the-horizon attack would not be perceived as devastating to a potential suicide bomber?
No, it's not perceived as controlling. You see, what the ground forces signal is control over their way of life. Think about Afghanistan. Many people are upset we're leaving Afghanistan because we're not controlling the future way of life of Afghan people. A lot of people in the West want to change how Afghans view women.
Right.
They want to change their culture.
Right.
Well, that's exactly what the suicide bombers are reacting to. They want their own freedom to determine their future, their self-determination. So when the ground forces go in, the ground forces signal not just military policy, but political control. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. So we put the ground forces in, we installed a government that became thoroughly corrupt, thoroughly illegitimate. The only thing holding that government there was our military force. Well, that's why the people are fighting against it.
Professor, we've got a break, back shortly from Beyond the Beltway.
No.
Bruce DuMont back, and let me ask Professor, before we go back, Professor, you're scheduled to be with us for about another 10 minutes. Could you stay a little bit longer, or do you have another engagement today?
Could I give you just another 10 minutes beyond that? Because I do have somebody at a
fine. No problem. We'll take that deal.
It's the
because we've got questions, a lot of questions from our in-studio guests. But I want to ask one more, and I'll try to make this my last question. A week from now, we're going to celebrate the 20th, or commemorate, not celebrate. We're going to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the attacks of 9/11 in 2001. Next Sunday night on this program, are we going to be talking about another major attack on the United States by the terrorists of the world, in your opinion?
You mean between now and the time the program airs?
Yes. No, I mean, between
Then
or
I'd say
next
highly
Sunday.
unlikely. Highly unlikely. You can never say never. This is all about analysis of risk. There's no 100% certainties, but the fact of the matter is that we have shifted, except for Afghanistan, to over the horizon as our policy in a number of areas. We've shifted to this in Africa and Somalia. We've used it quite successfully in Syria and Iraq against ISIS. This has been used not just by a Democratic administration, the Obama administration, but also the Trump administration. Now the Biden administration hopefully will be extending this into Afghanistan. And what you are seeing is that the more we have shifted to over the horizon, the fewer Western-directed attacks we're seeing. And the fact of the matter is you're also seeing that we're also able to do things to reduce their bases more effectively. So in Iraq today, ISIS has no base in Iraq. There hasn't been a suicide attack in Iraq this year. That's 8 months so far. We have a group at my center that tracks this extremely closely. And that's quite different than the years in Iraq when there were over 300 suicide attacks. So the fact is, if you looked at suicide attacks, the biggest killer in terrorism, and you track them and you'd see they're way down, and they've gone way down this year as a result of shifts here to over the horizon in most places. And I think even with the uptick that I just described, so I would be extremely on high alert here if I was at DHS and our FBI, and I'm pretty sure they are, to monitor what's happening in just in the last few weeks. I think given the extra level of alert, that's likely to offset the little bit of extra risk I just pointed to earlier. So no, I don't think there's likely to be an attack between now and the time your show airs.
Good.
And now we'll find out.
I hope you're right. Josh Cantrow.
Yes, certainly hope you're right about that, Professor. I wanted to go back to the 5 pieces that need to be in place to have a complete over-the-horizon strategy. And you had mentioned earlier in response to my question that one of those pieces is local intelligence networks, and that they that we don't have that now. And I take it the reason we don't have that now is because some of those folks that used to work with us have been captured or at risk of being captured by the Taliban. And also going forward, there would be a huge risk in terms of folks working with the U.S. in the future in light of the chaotic way we got out. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's really the second. Yeah, so what I think has happened is by leaving 80,000 special visa holders behind, and really, creating, sort of very thin opportunities, at least as we could see today, to go forward here. I think this creates a lot of lack of people willing to work with us and put their lives on the line for us. That has a lot to do with the way the withdrawal has happened. The way the withdrawal has happened and all the mistakes and so forth, I'm sure others are going to be talking about for a long period of time. Well, but that's in the past. Now, as we go forward, we may be able to rebuild relationships with some of those 80,000. They may be willing to provide information, not necessarily in any public way, but that's what the CIA does. And so it may well be the case that we're able to rebuild some of those networks. And in fact, if we can do a little bit to, help encourage better treatment here by the Taliban of certain of those special visa holders, this may help us quite a bit. So that's all to be seen in the future. But I am concerned that although earlier transitioning to over the horizon, we could have been more confident of having informant networks that would have been quite positive toward us, even if the Taliban took power. I think that now, given what's happened in the last few weeks, we need to recognize we have thrown a giant wrench into their confidence in us. The possible future informant network.
You mentioned a couple of segments ago that you had written a treatise or a book on the subject of how the United States and the Taliban could get along and build an alliance in the future. Can you elaborate? You started to give us a couple of points. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you think we may be able to have some coexistence with them?
Yeah, so it's an article in Foreign Policy magazine in August 2019 called How to Partner with the Taliban. The key thing is to start small and focus on our common interest against the security threat that ISIS-K, that's the ISIS group in Afghanistan, poses to both the Afghan Taliban and to American interests. What a lot of people are only now learning is that ISIS-K and the Afghan Taliban have been at each other's throats as bitter enemies, killing each other since 2015. These are not ideological friends working together. These are bitter war-fighting rivals here. So we have an opportunity to build on common interest. Now, how would you build on this? Number one, you start extremely small and narrow, focusing just on security, passing information that relates to targeting that group. And by the way, notice that we have had this head of the CIA meet with the head of the Taliban. So yeah. These kinds of things are never going, I don't think should ever be public, but we've already done quite a bit to show there's some, our top of our security force is talking to them. So I think that the next step here is to see, can that be extended beyond the airport? Well, we have a period before this, 2019, 20, 21, where we actually managed to shrink ISIS-K rather substantially in Afghanistan from 5,000 strong to 2,000 strong. Now, that may well have happened with some already covert security cooperation with between the Taliban and the United States. I don't know that. I wouldn't be surprised to find that out. We should be trying to build on that in the future. If that were to go forward, then we could try to expand that beyond some functional areas outside of security cooperation, such as hospitals. So COVID matters to the Afghan Taliban. They do care about this. Hospitals do matter. However, it might be the case that this may be a future step where we might be able to cooperate on issues of hospitals. Now, these cooperation, both the security and the hospital that I'm describing here, this may not happen through direct government-to-government contacts. We may not be having these face-to-face meetings. This may happen through DOA intermediaries. This may happen covertly, but this is what the CIA does. This is part of what we do. We know how to build relationships here under the radar that can be mutually beneficial.
But this would have, one thought about under the radar. Obviously, the United States allegedly has a surplus of vaccine to spread around the world. Do you see the possibility that we would be vaccinating Afghans in the wake of what's transpired here? And would anybody be able to survive politically?
I don't know that I see the possibility we're going to send the CDC as a group over to Kabul. I think, again, that there's a lot of ways to get that vaccine over to Afghanistan. And if we demand visible credit, this creates problems for both sides. The Biden administration, of course, is being criticized for working with the former enemy. Yeah. You can bet elements in the Taliban are criticizing the Taliban leadership for working with the former enemy.
It wouldn't play well on Fox News.
We need to remember that these are very, politically fraught issues. That said, when we left Vietnam, Kissinger and Nixon built a relationship with China, and this caught the world by surprise. and was one of the most effective things to help split the China from the Soviet Union, and became a very important part of our geopolitical strategy.
Right. We are going to have to pause. Thank you very much for agreeing to stick with us for another 10 minutes. So we're going to do that. Stick in another break is coming up literally in a matter of seconds. And then after that, we'll continue with our final segment with Robert Pape from the University of Chicago, and continue with our guests in studio, Josh Cantrow. He's the conservative Republican attorney, and Patrick Hanley. He is the management consultant who is a Democrat. I'm Bruce DuMont. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Beyond the Beltway on Labor Day 2021. Bruce DuMont back. It is our final segment in our broadcast this evening. Actually, we got a couple more segments to go. It's our last segment with Bob Pape. Bob, my question to you is, a lot of Americans and commentators are very upset with all of the equipment and the machinery that is being left behind. It's billions of dollars worth of equipment. As an expert in the field, how important is that in the big picture?
It's very important over the next 6 months or a year. It will not be probably longer than that. Things will run out, spare parts will run out, etc. But let me explain. The equipment that we're talking about is not the equipment so much we left at Bagram Air Force Base when we took out the air base when we took out the U.S. military troops. The biggest haul for the Taliban has been the equipment that we gave to the Afghan security forces under the fantasy that we were building somehow an Afghan national army. Now, this fantasy, we gave over $100 billion of aid to the Afghan security forces. Something like 25 billion of that went to military hardware, and that's what you're seeing them parading around in their in the videos. This is mostly coming almost all from the Afghan security force. So when the Afghan security forces melted away, the individual soldiers, they just took their stuff off, left home, and walked away. It's the Taliban who came in and picked up all that equipment. This is really just another consequence of the fantasy that, you know, we have witnessed now over the last 3 weeks, the puncturing of several key fantasies. The fantasy that we were somehow stabilizing Afghanistan. That's not been true for many years now. This fantasy that somehow we're building a liberal democracy, that has never been true. The fantasy we're building an Afghan army somehow that was going to look like the U.S. military just because we, said we gave them procedures to check on a checkbox. That is just simply was never going to occur. And what you're seeing as a consequence is all that equipment we gave them is now in the hands of the Afghan Taliban, which is one of the reasons we couldn't stay beyond August 31st in the airport. There's just way too much military equipment trained on us. We would have lost huge numbers of U.S. troops had we tried to stay. This is just, again, the fantasy of building the Afghan army. I just can't tell you how far this was from reality.
In looking at the lessons of what's transpired not only in the last 20 years but in the last 20 days, is this a failure of military? Is it a failure of the State Department? Is it a failure of exclusively presidential politics? Where does the blame go, or does anybody get away without blame?
Well, the fundamentally here is when we start to individualize blame, it goes to there are 4 presidents at issue here. So we need to recognize that the buck does stop somewhere in the United States, and it stops squarely on the desk of president. And we've now had 4 presidents that have had to deal with this issue. So now underneath that, we can talk about, the options and so forth that were put in front of those presidents. But the idea that we were really going to do nation building, even when we said we weren't doing it anymore, we're still trying to do it. This was, we thought we had learned a lesson from Vietnam that we couldn't do nation building. After 9/11, maybe we were just so wounded as a country that the American psyche was so wounded somehow. Possibly we just had to put that lesson out of our minds. We don't have a great explanation for that, but where the buck really stops is with the president, and we've had 4 presidents here. And so far, it's really just been the last who's really decided to rip the Band-Aid off of this fantasy. And unfortunately, you're seeing all the rot that was underneath that fantasy just coming into the sunlight.
The focus of Afghanistan, the war may not be with us as a discussion point, but certainly the fallout, the resettlement of tens of thousands of Afghanis coming to the United States, trying to rebuild their lives here. As you look at that monumental process, which we talked briefly about last Sunday night, and we'll talk about it in future programs, is there some fear that you have about all of these Afghanis that are coming here? They all have, or many have allegedly been vetted, but again, there are reports that many have not. Are you worried about any of them?
Yes. We do need to be aware that it would not be at all a surprise for ISIS-K to want to secret in somebody, or maybe more than somebody, right, among these refugees. So in Afghanistan, many of your viewers will know that the CIA thought they had worked with a certain doctor who had turned on the bad guys, and then he turned on them as a suicide bomber and killed 8 CIA officers here in Afghanistan. So we have seen, this kind of thing before. Unfortunately, what we need to rely on is kind of new vetting procedures in Doha, in Bahrain, in these more staging bases now where we have the refugees. But this is just part of, unfortunately, the price of ending this fantasy.
Given the numbers involved and the quickness with which this was supposed to have been done, isn't it realistic that, again, there's probably a number of them that slipped through the vetting cracks?
It's not, I wouldn't say, you can't put a risk number on it. So I understand, Bruce, people want to put a number on it and say, well, it's high, medium, or low. It's just not possible in an emergency situation like this. What you can do is you can recognize there was an emergency to move those refugees to staging bases. And now that they're at staging bases, that's where the real vetting process has to really begin. And so I think that we need to spend time, not just fly people from Doha here or Qatar to the United States on the next plane. We need to really understand that we need serious vetting that has to occur. That's going to be a diplomatic problem with those countries that have taken those refugees. It's going to be a practical problem for our State Department and our CIA, but it is nonetheless the problem that we face now that instead of moving them out slowly since last March is when we should have started, trying to move everybody out in just a few weeks, here as many as we could, this just has now pushed all those problems here forward. It hasn't stopped all those problems of vetting. It has now just moved them into a more difficult situation to solve. That is really just, again, we're going to be looking for months, if not years, to understand how we could have gotten this withdrawal plan so far off. But this is just one of the many issues to be answered in the coming months and years.
Professor, I want to thank you very much for being with us tonight, and I want to thank you very much for being with us many times over the last 20 years, offering your insight for my listeners on this program. I do appreciate it. But one last word. To those who gave their lives in support of this effort in Afghanistan, obviously their hearts are heavy. The families are heavy tonight, not just the 13 lost last week, but again, almost 2,500 over the last 20 years. Did they die in vain, in your view?
They died for all that is good in America that stands as a shining symbol. That doesn't mean America gets everything right. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. It means that America is a shining symbol because we can fix mistakes. So what we need to understand is those who died for all that is the best of America. That doesn't mean sticking with something because you decide, once you know it's wrong. It means you do what is best. And that is what has been great about our country. And that is what is so great about the people who put their lives and give, as Lincoln said, the last full measure for our country.
Professor Pape, thank you very much for being with us. That's Professor Robert Pape from the University of Chicago, who's joined us as our special guest this evening. Bob, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Bruce, and all you've done for the many years.
Thank you very much. We continue. Got another couple of minutes in this segment. Any further comment you want to make to summarize this discussion?
Yeah,
We're not done yet, but go ahead.
Well, I thought the professor's closing remarks were very poignant and moving about the question of dying in vain, and I thought it was a great question by you. And it's something that I've thought about a lot. My own brother served in Iraq in the second Gulf War back in 2003 and 2004. And he's fine, but there's a lot of people who have fought and died for our country.
Patrick?
That's right. There's something incredibly noble about being willing to put your life into danger for the protection of not only Americans, but of Afghans that folks served with. And so I think that's incredibly noble. I would also reflect that as we think about the risk of folks coming to our country and the risk of folks in special immigrant visas, we also should think about the level of support and welcome that we want to give them as they come to the United States. They've done such a service for us, and we owe them nothing less.
When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that particular point. I'm Bruce DuMont. Thanks very much for joining us tonight on Beyond the Beltway. One more segment coming up. Bruce DuMont back. Thanks very much for joining us. Before we say farewell, because we've got a few more minutes here, I do want to mention that next week on the program, it will be, obviously, it will be September 12th, and there will be a great deal of discussion and commemorative discussions about what happened in 2001 in this country. And next week we will add to that by having several survivors of the 9/11 attack, one at the Pentagon, one at the World Trade Center. They will be joining us to share their thoughts and opinions. And something that we were going to do, which is now an alteration in our plan, and I do want to share it with you because this is something that we were going to run on the radio next Sunday night. But we are not going to do that. However, we are going to make it available on all of our platforms of Beyond the Beltway, both radio and video and audio. And then that is, we are going to play the 20th anniversary broadcast that we did from Stockholm, Sweden, just days after the attack in 2011. Gada Tilhami, the professor from Lake Forest College, she was with us 20 years ago. Art Sear from the Clausen Professorship at Carthage College, he will be with us not only on the show from 20 years ago, he will be in studio as well. So again, this will be on our platform. It's not going to be on the air, on the radio, but if you go to beyondthebeltway.com, that's where you will be able to find not only the radio, but also the presentation of that program. And again, it's fascinating. I listened to it a couple of weeks ago. It's fascinating to get same day, not same day, it was about 3 hours, 3 days later, but almost instant reaction to what was happening in the world, what we thought was a good idea, what we thought was a bad idea. Our emotions were talking, our intellect was talking, and again, it'll be a good flashback, a moment in time to share with you at beyondthebeltway.com. That will start next Sunday, September 12th. Joining us now, we have a special phone caller, and that is an old friend of this program, Charles Lipsum, also from the University of Chicago. Charles, thanks very much for joining us on our broadcast. We've only got a few minutes left, but you had an opportunity to listen, albeit briefly, to some points that President Biden were making to the nation, because he was addressing the nation as we concluded, as we were taping the program that everyone has heard for the last 2 hours. So summarize what the president had to say.
It was one of the most disturbing and I would say dishonest speeches that I've ever heard a president make. He said that our withdrawal from Afghanistan was basically a complete success, and he used words like success. It wasn't. He said that we got 90% of the Americans out that we wanted to get out, as if that was a triumph. He had promised to get all of them out. I would say that in Manhattan on September 11th, 2001, over 99% of all the skyscrapers remained standing. I don't consider that a triumph. When he talked about the people we got out, he talked only about Americans. I don't know if he was including green card holders, and he certainly wasn't including families. To the extent, after saying it was all a success, all the problems were apparently due to Donald Trump. I mean, he continued. He doesn't seem to understand that there's an expiration date, like on old steaks at a supermarket. There's an expiration date on how long you can continue to blame your predecessor. And finally, he says that we have concluded our mission there because we accomplished what we wanted to, which was to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a terrorist haven. But that's precisely what it has now become. He, with not only with the Taliban, which now has Americans not just as stragglers or people who are staying behind, but as potential hostages. They can negotiate with us on the basis that they're holding our people. And there are
Charles,
Al-Qaeda has come back.
let me interject just for a moment, based just on your last point.
I'm just outraged.
No,
I'm just outraged.
I understand, but let me interrupt your outrage with a question.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Based on what we know, based on media coverage from a wide variety of media, it appears that the Taliban was cooperating with the American military as part of the exit strategy for Americans. They were providing safe coverage getting into the airport using secret methods. There have been other examples where the Taliban appears to be cooperating with American military. Do you give the Taliban any credit at all for at least trying to provide some semblance of credibility in the closing days of the war?
They did some things to help us. The fundamental mistake here was not, there were two very big ones toward the end. One was closing Bagram Air Base, which apparently all the military and diplomatic people said, oh, this is a great idea. It was a terrible idea. And then the other thing was that we should have evacuated in the winter. That's the reason that Trump's deadline was in May. They wanted to do it before the fighting season. Joe Biden, at age 78, taking his first decision-making position in his life, he made the decision that he would evacuate them in the middle of the fighting season.
But again, getting back to what the Taliban has said, and I understand that nobody wants, but again, they have also said they are going to work on making sure that the terrorists, specifically ISIS-K, do not set up a launching pad for terrorist attacks. Now, again, that's what they say, And again, you should judge people by what they do, not by what they say. But the Taliban has said some things that might be viewed as a positive, or at least as some, I don't even want to say red flag, or I don't want to say it, I don't want to overdo it. But again, do we have to consider that and give them the benefit of the doubt? You don't sound like you want to give them the benefit of the doubt.
The Taliban wants to prevent ISIS-K from becoming a power in Afghanistan because the Taliban wants to control the country.
Okay.
But you didn't hear the Taliban say that they wanted to stop the Al-Qaeda. You didn't hear them say that they wanted to stop the Haqqani network. Actually,
Charles, on that point, thank you very much. We are out of time. We're running into our break. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Bruce DuMont.